Jack Landry sat in the driver's seat of his old Chevy Silverado, the engine idling quietly as the warm Texas sun dipped low on the horizon. Outside his window, the familiar red and yellow sign of Lone Star Burgers flickered against the dusk sky. The logo had barely changed since the day Jack first sketched it out on a napkin at his kitchen table. Back then, it was just a dream, a burger joint that served good food, hired good people, and treated every customer like family. That was 20 years ago. Now Lone Star Burgers was a regional empire, stretching across Texas and beyond. 10 locations, hundreds of employees. Jack had become a household name in local business circles. The scrappy kid from Houston who turned a fryer job into a fortune. But somewhere along the way, the dream got complicated. Lately, the complaints had piled up faster than the profits. Customers flooding Yelp with one-star reviews, rude employees, wrong orders, dirty floors. None of it made sense. Lone Star wasn't supposed to be that kind of place. Jack had built this company on the idea that every cashier mattered as much as every customer. So how the hell had things gotten so far off track? He hadn't set foot in this particular location, the very first Lone Star, in more than a year. Corporate reports made everything look fine. Strong sales, steady traffic, decent margins. But Jack knew better than anyone how easy it was to hide cracks behind shiny numbers. He cut the engine and leaned back in his seat, running a hand through hair that had turned more silver than brown over the years. His phone buzzed on the console, another email from the board. Probably Sharon Fields, his VP of Operations, with her usual numbers over people updates. Jack ignored it. Tonight, the spreadsheets could wait. He reached into the glove box, pulling out an old Houston Astros cap and a pair of scuffed aviator sunglasses. His Lone Star Burgers polo, the same one his employees wore, was crumpled in the passenger seat, along with a pair of well-worn jeans. No CEO suit tonight. No polished watch or designer shoes. Tonight, Jack Landry was just another customer. He stepped out of the truck, the Texas heat wrapping around him like an old friend. The parking lot was half full. Families wrangling kids, teenagers glued to their phones, a couple of construction workers leaning on their tailgate finishing cold sodas. Jack used to know every regular by name. Now, no one even glanced his way. As he walked toward the entrance, a wave of memories hit him. The countless hours flipping burgers, scrubbing grease traps, sweeping floors after closing. Back then, the place felt alive. Employees joking behind the counter, customers calling out compliments to the cooks, the whole store buzzing with the easy warmth of a neighborhood joint. But tonight, something felt off. The automatic doors slid open, and Jack stepped into a wall of stale fryer oil and faint disinfectant. The air was thick, the lights too bright, the energy flat. No one greeted him. The girl at the counter, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a faded name tag pinned crookedly to her polo, didn't even glance up. Jack approached the counter, trying to catch her eye. "Evenin'," he said, keeping his voice casual. "How's your night going?" The cashier barely mumbled a response, fingers flying across the register buttons. Her name tag read, Rosa. Jack noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tight set of her shoulders. She was tired. Not the good kind of tired. The kind you felt after a long shift you were proud of. This was bone-deep exhaustion. The kind that comes from being overworked and underappreciated for too damn long. "Number 4 combo, please," Jack said. "Extra pickles." Rosa punched in the order, still without looking at him, and muttered the total. Jack handed over a crumpled 20, but before she could give him his change, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Rosa, for God's sake, move faster! You think these orders make themselves?" Jack's head snapped toward the kitchen. A tall man with slicked-back hair and a stained manager's badge, Felix Crowley, stood with arms crossed, his mouth curled into a scowl. Rosa flinched, fingers fumbling with the cash drawer. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry doesn't pay the bills," Felix barked. "You screw up one more time tonight and you're gone. I don't care what corporate says about needing to keep the diversity numbers up." Jack's stomach knotted. He had expected to see some sloppiness, maybe a few burnt fries or a sluggish line. But this was something else entirely. This was toxic, the kind of rot that eats a place alive from the inside out. Rosa handed Jack his change with trembling fingers, eyes glued to the counter. Jack wanted to say something, but the timing was wrong. He needed to see more. He stepped aside, pretending to check his phone while his blood boiled beneath his calm facade. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about a broken culture. And Jack Landry was going to find out exactly how deep the cracks ran. Jack settled into a booth near the window, the cracked vinyl seat creaking under his weight. From here, he had a clear view of both the counter and the kitchen. His burger sat untouched in its paper wrapper, condensation pooling under his drink. Eating was the last thing on his mind. Felix was pacing the line, barking orders at a cook who couldn't have been older than 19. The kid's hands shook as he flipped patties, trying to keep up with Felix's rapid-fire commands. Meanwhile, Rosa handled the counter alone, taking orders, bagging food, cleaning trays, running drinks. Every time she tried to catch her breath, Felix found something to criticize. "Rosa, wipe that counter again. Look at those fingerprints." "Rosa, where's the damn ketchup restock? What do you even do all day?" Jack's jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. It wasn't just Felix's words. It was the way he said them. Like Rosa wasn't even human. Just another piece of outdated equipment he wished corporate would haul off. The customers noticed too. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, teenagers smirked, and one elderly woman shook her head in quiet disapproval. That woman, Jack recognized her. Mrs. Louise Carter. She'd been a regular back when Jack worked the grill himself, always ordering the same thing: grilled chicken sandwich, no mayo, extra tomato. She caught Rosa's eye and gave her a soft smile, the kind that said, "I see you, honey, hang in there." Rosa tried to smile back, but the effort fell flat. Jack couldn't sit still any longer. He stood, crossed the dining room, and approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice low. "Do you have a comment card or a feedback form or something?" Rosa blinked at him, confused. I think there's a survey code on the receipt." "Perfect." Jack pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and pretended to examine it. "You've been working here long?" Rosa glanced nervously toward the kitchen before answering. "Almost 2 years." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's a long time in fast food." She gave a small shrug. "It's a job." Before Jack could respond, Felix stormed up to the counter. "Rosa, why are you chit-chatting? People are waiting." Jack turned to face him, still playing the part of a regular customer. "Relax, man. I was just asking about the survey." Felix forced a fake smile. Of course. Always good to get customer feedback. But the moment Jack turned away, Felix's expression darkened again. Jack returned to his booth, heart pounding, brain racing. One manager like Felix could sink a store, But the real fear was how many other Felixes were out there in his company. He pulled out his phone and, for the first time all evening, opened that email from Sharon Fields. Performance metrics, Q2 review. Line after line of numbers, all perfectly acceptable, but not a single word about people. Not a note about turnover rates, staff satisfaction, or customer complaints about service quality. Just sales, food cost, labor percentages. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. He had built Lone Star Burgers with his own hands, his own sweat, and his own values. But somewhere along the way, those values had gotten buried under spreadsheets and expansion plans. He wasn't running his company anymore. He was managing a machine. And tonight, that machine had shown him exactly how broken it was. He stood, tossed his untouched burger into the trash, and walked toward the door. Rosa was refilling the napkin dispenser, her shoulders hunched, her expression carefully blank. "Have a good night, Rosa," Jack said softly. She blinked, startled, and mumbled, "You too." Jack stepped out into the warm Texas night, but instead of heading to his truck, he stood on the sidewalk staring back at the store. His store. Tomorrow, he wouldn't come back as a customer. Tomorrow, he'd come back as the man who built this place, and the man who was about to tear it all down to build it right again. He pulled out his phone one last time, opening his contact list. His thumb hovered over Sharon's name, then moved past it, straight to Human Resources Director. "Hey," Jack said when the call connected. "I need to know everything about the manager at the Westheimer location. Every complaint, every incident report, anything with Felix Crowley's name on it." He ended the call, took a deep breath, and climbed into his truck. This wasn't just a bad night at a burger joint. This was a reckoning, and Jack Landry was ready to get his hands dirty all over again. The next evening, Jack Landry pulled into the back lot of the Westheimer Lone Star Burgers, parking near the delivery entrance. The truck he drove tonight wasn't his usual Silverado. It was a beat-up, dented van wrapped with the logo of a third-party food distributor. The logo didn't matter. All anyone would see was another exhausted delivery guy dropping off supplies, invisible to the people too busy keeping a chaotic kitchen running. Jack had always believed that the real truth of any business lived behind the scenes, in the stockroom, in the hurried conversations between shifts, in the way managers spoke when they thought no one important was listening. Tonight, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't even Jack Landry. Tonight, he was just the new guy from the supply company. Dressed in steel-toe boots, grease-stained jeans, and a faded baseball cap pulled low, Jack hoisted a case of frozen fries onto his shoulder and walked through the back door. No one batted an eye. The kitchen was a blur of frantic motion, fryers bubbling, timers shrieking, the hiss of the griddle, and the constant overlapping voices shouting orders and complaints. At the center of it all stood Felix Crowley. Even out of sight of customers, Felix's tone didn't change. "Where the hell is my onion ring order?" He barked at a teenager who was elbow-deep in a sink full of dishes. "You think this is a damn daycare?" Jack kept his head down, moving from the freezer to the dry goods shelf, unloading boxes and silently listening. Felix had built a kingdom of fear. That much was obvious within minutes. Employees avoided eye contact, flinched at every sharp word, and worked with the tense, robotic precision of people who knew mistakes were punished swiftly and publicly. As Jack stacked cases of burger buns, Rosa appeared from the front, her arms full of empty condiment bottles. She didn't see Jack, too focused on keeping her balance and avoiding Felix's glare. "Why are we out of ketchup again?" Felix snapped. Do I have to hold your damn hand every time we restock? Rosa didn't argue. She just nodded, her face carefully blank. Jack could see the fight in her eyes, the silent calculation of someone deciding whether today was the day she finally quit. Maybe if you spent less time screwing up orders and more time doing your job, we wouldn't have this problem, Felix added with a sneer. But hey, I guess I shouldn't expect much from charity hires. Jack's hands clenched around the corner of a box, knuckles going white. It took everything in him not to blow his cover right there. But he needed to know how deep this went. How much of this poison had seeped into his company's culture. And that meant staying silent. For now. Over the next hour, Jack delivered, stacked, and observed. He saw Cody and Nguyen, the teenage kitchen helper, hustling between tasks that should have been split between 3 people. Cody looked exhausted, his sneakers sliding across the greasy floor as he tried to keep up. At one point, Cody slipped, sending a bag of shredded lettuce flying. Felix pounced immediately. Are you kidding me? Are you completely useless? That's product loss, genius. You want to pay for that out of your paycheck? Cody mumbled an apology, cheeks burning, while the other employees studiously avoided looking at either of them. Jack's stomach churned. This wasn't a tough work environment. This was a war zone. And Felix wasn't a manager. He was a tyrant. Jack knew what came next. If this was how Felix treated his team off camera, there was no telling what kind of pressure or manipulation employees had endured to keep Felix looking good on paper. The numbers always looked good when fear kept mouths shut. When the delivery was done, Jack headed for the door, but not before catching Rosa's eye for a brief second. There was a flicker of recognition. She knew she'd seen him before. But the moment passed as Felix barked for her attention again. Stepping out into the night air, Jack took a slow breath. Tomorrow wouldn't be about watching anymore. Tomorrow would be about asking questions. The kind of questions Felix had no answers for. Jack didn't go straight home after leaving the store that night. Instead, he parked a few blocks away, pulled out a worn legal pad from the glove compartment, and began writing. Quick, shorthand notes. A habit he'd kept since his earliest days running Lone Star Burgers. Culture of fear, employees scared to speak. Felix rules through intimidation. High stress, low respect. He drew a hard underline beneath Felix's name. The manager wasn't just bad, he was cancerous. And Jack knew that cancers didn't just appear overnight. They grew in the dark, fed by silence, ignored complaints, and the lazy comfort of corporate indifference. How many more are out there? Jack flipped the page and started a new list. Names, shifts, notes on body language, who seemed confident, who seemed afraid. Rosa and Cody stood out immediately. They were clearly working harder than anyone else, covering for each other when the line got slammed. And then there was Hattie Johnson, the elderly cleaning woman who drifted quietly through the chaos like a ghost. Jack hadn't noticed her at first, but once he did, it was impossible to miss. Hattie was the one wiping down counters between orders, refilling the soda machine when no one else would, picking up after spills that weren't her fault. She worked with the steady patience of someone who had learned long ago not to expect thanks. That was the thing about employees like Hattie. They held the place together, but they were invisible until the day they didn't show up, and suddenly everything fell apart. Jack circled her name twice. He leaned back, staring up at the stars through the windshield, heart heavy. Lone Star had never been perfect, but he'd always believed it was different. The kind of place where the hardest workers got recognized, where kindness mattered as much as speed. But Felix wasn't an accident. Felix was a symptom. Jack had hired people like Felix because Sharon had recommended them. Sharon had trusted the district managers, and the district managers had trusted local store managers. Somewhere in that long chain of trust, someone like Felix slipped through, or worse, was encouraged. The next morning, Jack was back at the store before sunrise, this time wearing the full delivery uniform. Company-issued polo, faded cap, clipboard tucked under his arm. Rosa was already there, unlocking the front door, her face drawn but determined. "Morning," Jack said, keeping his voice low and friendly. Rosa blinked in surprise. "Oh, hey, you're the delivery guy from last night, right?" "That's me." Jack offered a hand. "Name's Jake." She shook it cautiously. "Rosa," he smiled. "Figured I'd start early today. You mind if I unload straight into the stockroom?" "Go ahead." Rosa glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "Just watch your step back there. Felix doesn't like people messing with his system." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Felix doesn't scare me." Rosa gave a half smile, the first real expression Jack had seen on her face, before heading inside. For the next 2 hours, Jack worked the back like any ordinary delivery guy. But this time, he asked questions. He asked Cody how long he'd been working there. He asked Hattie if the schedules were always this chaotic. He asked Rosa what made her stay when the job was this hard. Most of the answers were exactly what he expected. Low pay, fear of losing hours, needing the job to survive. But one answer stuck with him. "I stay because I like the customers," Rosa said quietly. "Some of them have been coming here for years. Mrs. Carter, you saw her last night? She brings me tamales at Christmas. People like her make it worth it." Jack's throat tightened. That was the Lone Star he'd built. That was the family-first, community-driven business he'd promised himself he would never lose sight of. Felix, Sharon, and the rest of the corporate machine had nearly crushed that spirit. But Rosa and people like her had held onto it with both hands. Jack knew exactly what he had to do next. As Felix rolled into the store 2 hours late, barking at Cody before he even reached the kitchen, Jack made his final note. "Tomorrow, the mask comes off, and Felix Crowley is going to remember exactly who Jack Landry is." The morning rush had just died down when Jack Landry walked through the front doors of Lone Star Burgers, not as a customer, not as a delivery guy, but as himself. No hoodie, no cap, no disguise. Today, he wore a crisp button-up shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to show the calloused hands that had once flipped burgers at this very grill. The air inside the restaurant seemed to shift the moment he stepped in. Rosa, cleaning the soda station, froze mid-wipe. Cody, carrying a tray of frozen patties to the kitchen, nearly dropped the entire load. Even Felix, leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone, took a moment to glance up, and then did a double take. "Morning, everyone," Jack said, his voice carrying just enough authority to turn every head. "Can I have a few minutes of your time?" Nobody moved at first. Felix squinted, confused, but Rosa's eyes widened in realization. She'd seen Jack's face before, not as a delivery guy, but on the framed photos near the entrance under Founder's story. Felix's confusion twisted into a forced grin. "Well, well, look who it is. Mr. Big Boss himself. What brings you down from the ivory tower, Jack?" Jack ignored the sarcasm. "I'm calling a staff meeting," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Right here, right now." Felix's grin faltered. Rosa set down her cleaning rag. Cody abandoned the patties. Employees emerged from the back, murmuring in low voices, unsure whether this was a reward ceremony or a mass firing. They gathered in a loose semicircle near the front counter. Jack took his place in the center, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the faces. Some were nervous, some defiant. Most just looked tired. "I started this place 20 years ago," Jack began. "Right here in this very building. I wasn't the CEO back then. I was the guy sweeping floors and burning fries and trying to figure out how to run a register without pissing off the lunch rush." A few employees chuckled quietly. "And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that," Jack continued. "I spent so much time in boardrooms and staring at spreadsheets that I forgot what this place actually feels like. What it's like to stand behind this counter and take orders from someone who treats you like dirt. To clean up messes you didn't make. To hold it all together while no one even bothers to say thank you." He let the silence settle, heavy and real. "Which brings me to you, Felix," Jack said, turning to face the manager directly. "You've been running this store for what, 3 years?" Felix shifted, uncomfortable under the spotlight. "That's right. And in those 3 years, employee turnover has doubled. Customer complaints have tripled. And every time someone from corporate asked you why, you blamed the staff, didn't you?" Felix's smile hardened. "Well, maybe if corporate sent us better people—" "Stop," Jack cut in, his voice like a knife. "Don't you dare blame them." He gestured toward Rosa, Cody, and the rest of the crew. "These people aren't the problem. You are." Felix's face flushed red, but before he could protest, Jack raised a hand. "I've spent the past 2 days watching you humiliate your team. I've heard the way you talk about them when you think no one important is listening. And I've seen how you've turned this store into a place people hate coming to work." The room went deadly silent. "You're done, Felix," Jack said simply. "As of right now, you're fired." Felix's mouth hung open for a second, like his brain couldn't quite process what had just happened. Then the color in his face shifted from red to pale, his bravado collapsing into disbelief. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "You're firing me? After everything I've done for this place?" Jack took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for the crew to lean in to hear. "You didn't do anything for this place, Felix. You did everything to it. You took a team of hardworking people and made them feel worthless. You treated customers like they were an inconvenience. And you poisoned a culture I spent 20 years building." Felix tried to laugh, but it came out thin and forced. "You're making a mistake. This store runs because of me. You fire me and this whole place will fall apart." "No, Felix," Jack said. "It's because of you that this place almost fell apart. And it's because of people like Rosa and Cody and Hattie that it's still standing." Felix opened his mouth again, but Jack didn't wait. He turned to Rosa. "Rosa, I need you to step up. Effective immediately, you're acting manager." Rosa's eyes widened. "Me? I'm just—" "You're not just anything," Jack interrupted. "I've seen you carry this store on your back while Felix barked orders from the sidelines. You care about the customers. You care about your team. That's the kind of leadership this place needs." Felix let out a bitter laugh. "Seriously? You're replacing me with a cashier. Good luck with that." Jack's expression didn't change. "Take your things and leave, Felix. I'll have HR follow up with your final paperwork." For a moment, Felix looked like he might argue, but then he saw the way the staff was looking at him, not with fear, but with quiet relief. He grabbed his jacket, muttering under his breath, and stormed out the back door. The room stayed silent for a beat longer, everyone still processing what had just happened. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Hattie started to clap. It was slow, deliberate, and soon Cody joined in, followed by the rest of the team. Rosa stood frozen, eyes darting between Jack and the door Felix had just slammed. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Jack's voice softened. "You already have been. You've been leading without the title. Now you'll have the title too." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'll be here to support you, but this is your store now." The applause died down, replaced by the hum of employees quietly returning to their stations, unsure what came next. Jack knew what they were all wondering. Was this just a stunt? Or was this the start of something real? "All right," Jack said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've got work to do. Starting tomorrow, this store gets a fresh start, and we're going to make Lone Star something we can all be proud of again." He caught Rosa's eye one more time. There was still fear there, but beneath it, Jack saw something else. Hope. As Jack turned toward the office to start reviewing Felix's records, he knew one thing for sure. Today wasn't the end of this fight. It was only the beginning. Rosa stood in the center of the break room, her hands still shaking as she clutched the laminated manager on duty badge Jack had handed her just moments ago. It felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of every expectation, every set of eyes now watching her, had somehow soaked into the thin plastic. She barely had time to breathe before the first question hit her. "Hey, Rosa." Cody stood in the doorway, nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. "We're out of medium drink lids, and the supplier order says they won't come till Monday. What do we do?" Rosa's stomach knotted. Medium lids. Something so small, yet suddenly it felt monumental. Felix would have barked at Cody to figure it out, but Rosa wasn't Felix. "Okay," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "We'll swap the medium cups for large at no extra charge. Just let the customers know." Cody nodded, relief flickering across his face before he hurried back to the counter. Rosa exhaled, but the moment of calm didn't last. From the front, she could hear the fryer alarm screeching, followed immediately by Hattie calling out, "Rosa!" The oil's smoking again. Rosa raced to the kitchen, heart pounding in her chest. The fryer oil was bubbling too high, dark streaks floating across the surface, a clear sign the oil hadn't been changed when it should have. She glanced at the maintenance log hanging beside the fryer. Felix had signed off that the oil was changed 2 days ago. He'd lied. Hattie stood nearby, wiping her hands on her apron, her face calm, but her eyes wary. "Want me to shut it down?" Rosa swallowed hard. She could almost hear Felix's voice in her head. "Keep cooking. It's too expensive to toss the oil." "No," Rosa said firmly. "We drain it and replace it. I don't care what the log says." Hattie smiled, the first genuine smile Rosa had seen from her in weeks. "That's the right call, honey." As they worked side by side, Rosa realized how much Hattie knew, not just about the cleaning schedules and the supply orders, but about the quiet rhythms that made the store function. Felix had ignored her because she wasn't loud, but Rosa understood. Hattie was the glue. The door chimed up front, and Rosa's attention snapped back to the counter. A group of regulars walked in, construction workers who'd been coming to this Lone Star for years. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a sunburned neck, glanced around the store, then frowned. "Where's Felix?" he asked, voice carrying across the dining room. Rosa felt the air shift. Employees stopped moving, waiting to see how she'd answer. "He's gone," Rosa said simply, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm running things now." The man's eyebrows shot up. "You? No offense, but you're just a cashier?" Rosa finished for him. "Not anymore." The man gave her a long, skeptical look, but after a moment he shrugged. As long as my burger's hot and my fries are crispy, I don't care who's running the place. Rosa nodded, hiding the knot of anxiety twisting tighter in her chest. Winning over the staff was one thing. Winning over the regulars, the heart of Lone Star's business, that was something else entirely. Before she could dwell on it, the register beeped, a customer waiting. Rosa stepped forward, slipping naturally into her old role, but now with the weight of every decision resting on her shoulders. The rest of the shift felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. Every decision Rosa made, every substitution, every staffing adjustment, every customer complaint she handled, felt like it was being silently judged by the crew. Some employees followed her lead without hesitation, like Cody and Hattie, who both seemed quietly relieved Felix was gone. But others, not so much. By the middle of the lunch rush, Rosa could feel the resistance rising. Mark, a grill cook who'd been there nearly as long as Felix, leaned against the prep table watching Rosa with narrowed eyes. "So, what's the plan, boss?" he asked, the word boss dripping with sarcasm. "We gonna do everything by the book now? Or are you just gonna make it up as you go?" A few of the younger staff snickered. Rosa's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to stand tall. "The plan is simple," she said. "We do the job right. No shortcuts, no screaming, no cutting corners just to save time." Mark snorted. "That sounds nice in theory. Let's see how long you last when orders start piling up and corporate starts breathing down your neck." Rosa didn't answer. Instead, she stepped onto the line herself, sliding next to Mark at the grill. Without a word, she grabbed a spatula and started flipping burgers. Fast, clean, perfectly timed. She didn't lecture or argue. She worked side by side, showing that she could handle the heat just like anyone else. At first, Mark just rolled his eyes. But after a few minutes, when the line moved faster than it had all week, even he couldn't deny the difference. "She's got some moves," Cody whispered to Hattie, who just smiled knowingly. But Rosa knew winning over the crew was only half the battle. The customers were watching too. At the front counter, Mrs. Carter walked in, her purse tucked under her arm, her smile warm despite the chaos around her. "There's my Rosa," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You're finally running the place, huh?" Rosa felt her throat tighten, but she smiled back. "Trying my best, Mrs. Carter." "Trying's all anyone can ask," the older woman said, setting her purse down. "Now, do I still get my extra tomato?" "You bet," Rosa said, hands already moving to pack Mrs. Carter's usual order. The whole exchange took less than a minute, but the energy in the room shifted. Regulars who'd known Rosa for years started to see her differently, not just as the quiet cashier, but as someone who'd earned her place behind that counter. But just as that tiny spark of confidence lit in Rosa's chest, the universe threw its first real test her way. A delivery driver burst through the back door, breathless and sweating. "Hey, quick heads up," he said, waving a clipboard. "Half your produce order got rerouted. No lettuce, no tomatoes, no onions until tomorrow." Rosa's heart skipped. Without those ingredients, at least a third of the menu would need adjustments. Felix would have lost his mind, probably screamed at the driver, then the kitchen, then whoever answered the phone at the supplier. But Rosa wasn't Felix. She took a deep breath, grabbed the clipboard, and scanned the order herself. "All right," she said, voice calm. "Here's what we're going to do." She gathered the crew, even Mark, right there in the kitchen. Together, they reworked the prep list, updated the menu board, and started scripting apologies they could give to customers up front. No lies, no excuses, just honesty and solutions. Some customers grumbled, a few even walked out, but most appreciated the honesty. And for the first time in a long time, the crew worked like a team, solving a problem together instead of tearing each other down. By the end of the shift, Rosa was physically drained, her feet aching and her nerves frayed. But for the first time since Jack had handed her that manager badge, she felt something close to pride. As she locked up for the night, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass door, sweaty, exhausted, but still standing. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, she knew. Some employees would still test her. Some regulars might doubt her. And corporate, with all its pressures and politics, was waiting just around the corner. But tonight, Rosa Martinez had survived her first day as manager. And tomorrow, she'd be ready to fight again. Rosa unlocked the door to Lone Star Burgers at 6:45 the next morning. The sky still dark, the air thick with humidity. The soreness in her legs and the dull ache in her lower back were reminders of just how much ground she'd covered during her first full day as acting manager. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the weight sitting squarely on her shoulders now. The silent knowledge that some people were waiting for her to fail. She flipped on the lights, the familiar hum of the soda machines kicking to life, and made her first round through the store. The kitchen was spotless. Hattie had stayed late to make sure of it, and Rosa made a mental note to thank her again. But when she reached the break room, her stomach sank. The whiteboard where Felix used to post his sarcastic manager notes had been wiped clean, except for one phrase scrawled in red marker. "Good luck, Queen Rosa. Hope you last a week." Rosa swallowed hard, staring at the words. The handwriting was familiar, though no name was signed. She could guess easily enough. Mark. Maybe a few others who'd been loyal to Felix, the ones who resented her promotion, the ones who thought she didn't belong. She took a deep breath, grabbed the eraser, and scrubbed the message off the board. They were going to test her. Fine. Let them. The first wave hit during breakfast prep. Cody arrived early as usual and immediately got to work on the egg station. But the supply order was late. No bacon, no cheese, no tortillas for breakfast wraps. Rosa called the supplier herself, only to be told that someone from the store had called in late last night to adjust the order, cutting those items. She felt heat rise in her face, but her voice stayed calm. "Thanks for letting me know," she said before hanging up. It was sabotage, clear and deliberate. Someone wanted customers to start the day annoyed, and wanted that blame to land squarely on her. "All right," Rosa said, gathering the team in the kitchen. "Change of plans. We'll offer every customer a free hash brown if they order a combo. Let's turn this into a win." Cody grinned. Free food always makes people happy. Not everyone shared his optimism. Mark leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "That's cute," he said. "But you're just buying time. What happens when corporate sees we're giving food away?" "We log it," Rosa said. "I'll send the report to corporate myself." Mark snorted, but Rosa didn't flinch. She could feel it. The battle lines were drawn. The sabotage didn't stop after breakfast. Throughout the day, Rosa noticed small but deliberate problems cropping up, each one designed to make her look incompetent. A stack of buns left out overnight had gone stale, even though the closing checklist showed they were properly stored. Cleaning logs were mysteriously missing entries, making it seem like Rosa had skipped inspections. Even the fryer temperature was mysteriously adjusted between shifts, resulting in undercooked fries during the lunch rush. Every time Rosa found something off, she fought the same inner battle. Was this incompetence, or was someone actively trying to sink her? She knew the answer, and so did Hattie. That Mark boy and his crew think they're being clever, Hattie muttered as she scrubbed down the prep table. They think if they make you look bad enough, Jack'll come crawling back and beg Felix to save the day. Rosa sighed, leaning against the counter. I just want to do the job. I'm not trying to take sides or play politics. Too late for that, honey, Hattie said softly. You already won just by standing here. That truth sat heavy in Rosa's chest. For Mark and the others, this wasn't about who ran the store. It was about who deserved to run it. In their eyes, Rosa had skipped the line, jumped from cashier to manager without paying the same dues they thought they had. Felix had filled their heads with that poison for years, convincing them that only a certain kind of person could lead. Rosa wasn't that kind of person, at least not in their eyes. But she knew something they didn't. She knew what it felt like to fight for every inch. So when the soda machine accidentally got unplugged during the dinner rush, Rosa didn't lose her temper. She grabbed a bucket of ice, offered free bottled water to every customer, and personally apologized for the inconvenience. When the wrong inventory list got printed, and they found themselves short on condiments, she stood at the counter with Cody, explaining the mix-up to customers face to face, treating every complaint like it was her own personal responsibility. Slowly, something started to shift. Customers who had once grumbled began to notice that Rosa wasn't just another manager hiding in the office. She was there, hands-on, fixing problems in real time, facing every challenge head-on. Even some of the employees who had silently sided with Mark began to soften, seeing how Rosa handled herself. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't shout. She didn't dodge responsibility. She simply led. By closing time, the tension in the air had eased, just a little. But Rosa knew this was far from over. Mark and his group weren't done testing her. Felix might have been fired, but his shadow still hung over the store like a storm cloud. As she locked the doors and stepped into the warm Texas night, Rosa glanced back at the darkened restaurant. Tomorrow would bring another round of battles, and she wasn't sure what shape they'd take. But for tonight, she'd held the line. Tomorrow, she'd push it forward. Rosa's phone buzzed on her nightstand just after 5:30 a.m., the harsh vibration pulling her out of the light sleep she'd managed to get after another long closing shift. She groaned, reaching blindly for the phone, her heart already sinking before she even saw the screen. 15 missed calls. 3 from the assistant manager at the neighboring location, 4 from Cody, and the rest, all from an unknown number. The group chat for her team was exploding with messages, too fast to read. Rosa's stomach knotted as she opened the first link Cody had sent. It was a video. The shaky footage showed the front counter at her Lone Star Burgers, filmed from the customer side. Rosa was behind the register, smiling tightly as she explained the missing condiments to a visibly irritated man who held his phone right in her face. The video was captioned, "This is what customer service has come to? Lone Star can't even keep ketchup in stock. What a joke." Rosa felt her throat tighten as the comment section loaded. Typical. Get rid of the real managers and give the job to some diversity hire. That's what happens when you let a cashier run the show. I miss Felix. At least he knew what he was doing. It had only been posted a few hours earlier, but it already had over 50,000 views. Someone had even tagged the official Lone Star Burgers account, practically begging corporate to step in. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the flood of reactions, some customers defending her, others piling on. but the loudest voices were the cruelest ones. Her first instinct was to call Jack, but she hesitated. This was her fight. She needed to handle it herself, at least at first. By the time she arrived at the store, the local news van was already parked outside. A young reporter stood near the entrance, microphone in hand, waiting for a live segment to start. Rosa's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear herself think. Inside, the crew was silent, their usual banter replaced with uneasy glances in her direction. Even Hattie looked worried. "You saw it, huh?" Cody asked quietly, standing near the fryer. Rosa nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "We're not hiding from this," she said, voice firm despite the fear twisting in her gut. "We show up, we work hard, and we tell the truth." Mark snorted from across the room. "Truth won't matter once corporate sees that mess online. They're gonna want someone's head." Rosa met his gaze, refusing to blink. "Then they can have mine, after I've done my job." The breakfast shift started slower than usual. Fewer customers, more awkward silences. The regulars who did come in gave Rosa polite, hesitant smiles, but it was clear they'd seen the video too. Lone Star wasn't just a neighborhood burger joint today. It was a headline, and Rosa was the face of it. She kept her head down, focused on every detail. Clean counters, friendly greetings, orders double-checked before they left the kitchen. If anyone was going to judge her, they'd judge her on her work, not a viral clip twisted to make her look incompetent. But even as Rosa pushed forward, the weight of it all hung heavy on her back. Every time a phone came out, every time someone pointed toward the counter, her stomach flipped. Were they filming? Were they waiting for her to mess up again? By mid-morning, the regional manager showed up, a corporate suit Rosa had only met once during orientation. His smile was forced, his handshake too firm, like he was already preparing to clean up a disaster. "We need to talk," he said, leading Rosa into the office. The same cramped, cluttered space where Felix used to sit like a king on his greasy throne. The door closed behind them, and the manager wasted no time. "Corporate is concerned about the optics," he said. "This video, it's not just bad for your store, it's bad for the whole brand." Rosa nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. "I understand, sir." He sighed, flipping through a printout of customer complaints, most of them about Felix's era, but now conveniently pinned to her. "Look, you seem like a nice girl, but Lone Star can't afford this kind of attention. The board is already talking about replacing you with someone more experienced." Rosa swallowed hard. "I've been here for almost 2 years. I know this store. I know these customers. If you replace me now, you'll be sending the message that every employee here was right to be scared, that Felix's way worked, and it didn't." The manager shifted uncomfortably, but before he could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Hattie poked her head in, holding up a printed email. "This just came in," she said. "Thought you might want to see it." Rosa took the paper, her breath catching as she read the subject line, "To whom it may concern." In defense of Rosa Martinez. It was from Mrs. Carter, and it wasn't just a note. It was a letter, a full, heartfelt account of how Rosa had once paid for her meal out of her own pocket when Mrs. Carter forgot her wallet, and how Rosa always greeted her by name, remembered her order, and treated her like family. And Mrs. Carter wasn't alone. Attached to the email were over a dozen messages from regular customers, all speaking up for Rosa. "She's not the problem," one email read. "She's the reason we still come here." Rosa's throat tightened, her fingers trembling as she handed the paper to the regional manager. He scanned the letters, his expression softening with every line. "Well," he said finally, this changes things." Rosa exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest lifting just a little. Outside the office, the team was waiting. Cody, Hattie, even Mark, all pretending they weren't eavesdropping. Rosa stepped back into the kitchen, voice clear and steady. "We've got a lunch rush coming, and we're going to handle it like pros. No shortcuts, no drama, just good food and good service." Cody grinned. Hattie gave a proud nod, and even Mark, after a long pause, put on his apron without a word. The storm wasn't over. Corporate would still watch her like a hawk, and the internet never forgot a scandal. But for today, Rosa had something stronger than fear. She had her customers. Rosa stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the hum of the fluorescent light filling the silence. Her shift was over, but she hadn't left the store yet. She couldn't. Not with the knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the exhaustion, the anxiety, the creeping doubt that had taken root ever since the video went viral. Even with Mrs. Carter's letter and the outpouring of support from regular customers, Rosa couldn't shake the voice whispering in the back of her mind, "What if they're right? What if I really don't belong here?" The door creaked open, and Cody peeked in. "You okay, Rosa?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "We're locking up now. Want me to walk you to your car?" "No, I'll be fine." Cody lingered for a second before nodding and disappearing down the hall. Rosa took one last look at herself. Dark circles under her eyes, hair frizzed from the humidity, a stain from ketchup on her sleeve. Not exactly the picture of leadership. As she walked into the dining room, the store quiet after closing, she noticed a folded piece of paper taped to the register. Her name was written across the front in sloppy block letters. She unfolded it and felt her stomach drop. "Give it up, Rosa. You don't belong here." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the note, her heart racing. It could have been Mark, or one of his friends, or maybe someone she hadn't even suspected yet. She stuffed the note in her pocket and stepped outside into the heavy Texas night. The parking lot was nearly empty, just her car and Hattie's old Buick left under the flickering streetlight. As she unlocked her door, her phone buzzed, a message from Jack. "Proud of you today. I know it's been rough, but you're stronger than you think." Rosa smiled faintly, leaning her forehead against the steering wheel for a moment. Maybe Jack believed in her. Maybe the customers believed in her. But could she believe in herself? Rosa drove home with the windows cracked open, letting the warm night air rush in to clear her head. The streets were quiet, but her mind wasn't. That note, 8 simple words scribbled in cheap ink, carried more weight than they should have. She'd heard whispers like that before, back when she first got hired at Lone Star. Some of Felix's buddies used to joke that she only got the job because corporate needed to check off a diversity box. She brushed it off back then, too eager to prove herself. But now, with the manager title pinned to her chest, those whispers had grown teeth. "You don't belong here." The words gnawed at her during the short drive home. They followed her up the stairs to her apartment, through the front door, and into her tiny kitchen, where the only sound was the hum of her aging refrigerator. Rosa set her keys down, the paper note still clutched in her hand. She thought about texting Jack, about showing him the note, about admitting just how much it shook her. But something stopped her. If she leaned on Jack for every doubt, every moment of fear, What kind of leader would she be? Instead, she unfolded the paper again, stared at the words, then slowly tore it into pieces, letting the scraps fall into the trash. She didn't need to fight Felix's ghost. She needed to fight for herself. The next morning, Rosa arrived at the store before sunrise, hours before anyone else. She brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at the manager's desk, her desk now, and pulled out a clean notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Why I belong here." She stared at the blank space beneath it for a long time before the words started coming. "Because I've worked every station in this store. I know our regulars by name, so Felix walked away. I stayed. And because I care more about these people than I care about being liked." The list wasn't long, but it was enough. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the empty dining room, Rosa stood up, pinned the list to the bulletin board, and took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over. Far from it. But today, Rosa Martinez belonged. The conference room at Lone Star's regional headquarters was nothing like Rosa had imagined. She expected something sleek and modern, like the corporate offices she'd seen in movies. Glass walls, leather chairs, fancy coffee machines in the corner. Instead, the room was bland and tired, with stained carpet, mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard that still had notes from a months-old inventory meeting scrawled across it. Jack stood near the front, sleeves rolled up, speaking to a group of managers Rosa had never met. These were the people who ran other Lone Star locations across Texas. Store leaders who had been with the company for years, some even longer than Jack himself. They sat in a loose circle, arms crossed, faces guarded, waiting to see what the boss had dragged them here for. Rosa sat near the back, trying to make herself small, unsure why Jack had even asked her to come. She wasn't a district manager. She wasn't anyone important in this room. And yet, Jack had insisted. "You need to see this," he'd told her. "As most of you know," Jack said, voice clear and steady, "we had an incident at the Westheimer store last week. A viral video, some ugly comments online, and a lot of noise from corporate." Several managers exchanged knowing glances. Rosa could feel the weight of their silent judgment pressing against her back. "Hati, what you might not know," Jack continued, "is that the manager responsible for that store's toxic culture was fired and replaced by someone who had more heart and grit than most people I've ever worked with." Now every head turned toward Rosa. She kept her gaze fixed on the table, cheeks burning. "Rosa," Jack said, motioning for her to stand. "Come up here." Her legs felt like lead, but somehow she made it to the front of the room. She stood beside Jack, hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes locked on a scuff mark on the floor. "This is Rosa Martinez," Jack said. "She started at Lone Star 2 years ago as a cashier, and when Felix Crowley left that store in flames, she stepped up." The room stayed silent. A few managers raised their eyebrows, unimpressed. One older man near the front, a guy with a gut straining against his polo shirt, leaned back in his chair and muttered, "A cashier? Seriously?" Rosa's stomach clenched, but she kept her face still. She'd heard that tone before. Jack's eyes flicked toward the man who had muttered, but he didn't pause or scold him. Instead, Jack smiled faintly, like he'd been expecting exactly that reaction. "You're right," Jack said, voice even. "Rosa was a cashier, and maybe to some of you, that makes her less qualified to stand here today." He took a step forward, his boots scuffing against the worn carpet. "But let me remind you, I was a cashier once too. I scrubbed floors and cleaned fryers and took out the trash at this very company before I ever dreamed about being a CEO. The room shifted. A few arms uncrossed. The man in the front squirmed slightly. "But this isn't about me," Jack said, gesturing to Rosa. "This is about what leadership really means. It's not about how many years you've held a title or how many spreadsheets you've memorized. It's about whether or not your team trusts you. It's about whether your people would follow you, not because they have to, but because they want to." Jack stepped back, leaving Rosa alone at the front of the room. For a second, her mind went blank, but then she remembered the list she'd written that morning, the reasons she belonged, and she realized no one else in this room knew those reasons. Not yet. So she took a breath and spoke. "I know I'm not what you expected," Rosa said, her voice softer than Jack's, but steady. "And I know a lot of you probably think I got this job because Jack felt sorry for me, or because someone upstairs wanted to look good after Felix got fired." She let that sit for a moment. No one argued. "But the truth is," she continued, "I'm standing here because I know what it's like to be scared to come to work. I know what it's like to hold your breath every time your manager walks by, praying you don't get screamed at in front of customers." Several managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I know what it's like to take pride in a job most people look down on," Rosa said, her voice gaining strength. "Because even when I was just a cashier, I knew my job mattered. To my team, to my customers, to my family." She took a deep breath. "And that's why I stayed. When Felix left, when the video went viral, when everyone told me I wasn't good enough. I stayed because this isn't just a job to me. It's my store, my team, my community." The room was silent, but it wasn't the cold silence of judgment anymore. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are actually listening. Jack stepped forward again, his voice quiet but firm. "This is the kind of leadership Lone Star needs. Not fear, not intimidation, not bullying disguised as tough management. What we need are leaders who give a damn. Leaders who know their people by name and care about more than just the bottom line." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I brought Rosa here today not just to introduce her," Jack said, "but to ask all of you, when was the last time you really looked at your teams? When was the last time you asked what they needed, or how they were doing, or if they even liked coming to work?" The room stayed quiet, but several managers looked down at their notepads, unable to meet Jack's eye. "Things are changing at Lone Star," Jack said, "and Rosa isn't the exception. She's the new standard." Rosa's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was pride. When the meeting ended, several managers came up to shake her hand. Some were polite but distant. Others were genuinely curious, asking how she handled the lunch rushes or what she did when inventory got short. But one, the same man who had scoffed at her earlier, lingered longer than the rest. "I used to think like Felix," he admitted quietly. "Toughen him up or get rid of him? But maybe it's time I rethink that." Rosa smiled. It's never too late to lead differently. As she left the room, walking beside Jack, Rosa knew this wasn't the end of the fight. Not even close. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. The ballroom at the Lone Star Burgers annual leadership conference was bigger than Rosa had expected. Too big, she thought, for someone like her. The stage sat at the far end, framed by two massive banners. One showing the company's founding story, with a young Jack Landry smiling over a grill, and the other showing a sleek, modern Lone Star logo, the version corporate had rolled out a few years back. Rows of tables filled the room. every seat occupied by managers and assistant managers from across Texas. Some faces were friendly, people who had shaken her hand after the regional meeting with Jack. Others were unreadable, neutral, or mildly curious, waiting to see what this cashier-turned-manager had to say. Rosa stood behind the curtain, clutching the edges of the note cards she'd written the night before. Her palms were sweaty, her throat dry. Cody had helped her rehearse, playing the part of skeptical managers, throwing tough questions her way until her answers came naturally. But now, with the real audience just steps away, all of that practice felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Jack appeared beside her, his smile easy, his presence grounding. Nervous? Terrified, Rosa admitted. Good, Jack said. That means you care. Before she could reply, her name was announced. Rosa stepped into the spotlight, the heat from the stage lights sharp against her skin. She blinked at the sea of faces, took a slow breath, and set her note cards down. I was going to read this, she said, her voice softer than the microphone probably wanted. But if I've learned anything the past few weeks, it's that the truth doesn't always fit on a note card. A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Rosa didn't smile. This wasn't a joke. My name is Rosa Martinez, she said, her voice gaining strength. And 2 years ago, I was standing behind the counter at the Westheimer store, wearing a cashier badge, learning how to count change faster during lunch rush. I never thought I'd be standing here today. She glanced at Jack, who gave her a small nod. I'm not here because I'm the best manager in this company, Rosa continued. I'm here because I survived a store that was broken. And when Felix walked out those doors, I stayed, not because I wanted a promotion, but because I couldn't leave my team behind. Rosa took another breath, her voice steadier now. I stayed because I knew what it felt like to be treated like I didn't matter. Like I was just another body filling a shift, replaceable the second I made a mistake. And I stayed because I believed something Felix never did. That the people standing behind the counter are just as important as the people standing in front of it. The room went quiet, the kind of silence that meant people were really listening. She glanced down at her hands for a moment, fingers curled tightly around the edge of the podium, before looking back up. Felix didn't fail because he was bad at running a store. He failed because he forgot what this place was supposed to be. Lone Star was never meant to be about policies and quotas and perfect numbers on a spreadsheet. It was supposed to be about people. A manager near the front shifted in his seat, arms crossed. Rosa saw the doubt flicker across his face, the same doubt she'd seen on day one as acting manager. She didn't shy away from it. I'm not perfect, Rosa admitted. I've made mistakes. I'm still learning. But every single day I show up ready to work alongside my team, not above them, not in front of them, with them. And I can promise you this. My crew knows I've got their backs, the same way I know they've got mine. She paused, letting that sink in. And if you think that's soft or weak leadership, ask yourself this. When was the last time one of your employees stood up for you? When was the last time someone stayed late to cover a shift because they believed in you, not because they were scared of you? Rosa let the silence hang, knowing the truth was heavier than anything else she could say. This company's changing, she finished. And if you want to keep up, you've got to decide what kind of leader you want to be. I know the kind I want to be. The kind who remembers that people come first. Always. The applause started slow, then grew louder, spreading across the room like a rising tide. Jack was the first to stand, followed by Hattie, who had somehow found her way into the back row. and then Cody, clapping so hard his hands were red. As Rosa stepped down from the stage, heart still pounding but head held high, she knew this wasn't just about winning over this room. It was about proving, to herself and everyone else, that belonging isn't about where you start. It's about what you're willing to fight for. The applause was still fading when Jack stepped back onto the stage, standing right where Rosa had stood just moments before. But he didn't go to the podium. Instead, he walked to the center, closer to the managers seated in the front rows, closing the distance between the CEO and the people who ran his stores every single day. "I asked Rosa to speak today for a reason," Jack said, voice steady but serious. "Because her story isn't just her story. It's the story of a lot of people who work for us. People who show up every day, work hard, care about their teams and their customers, and still go home wondering if anyone even notices." He paused, letting that truth settle into the room. "For too long, we've rewarded managers for one thing: the numbers, labor costs, food costs, speed of service, and yeah, those things matter. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that the numbers only exist because of people." Jack glanced around the room, his gaze landing on familiar faces. Managers who had been with him for years, some of whom had been part of his early success, others who had been promoted under the old culture that Felix represented. "That changes today," Jack said. "Starting now, Lone Star's performance reviews will include something new: culture scores. Every quarter, every manager will be evaluated not just on numbers, but on employee retention, feedback from their teams, and customer experience surveys focused on how your crew feels about working here." The murmurs started immediately. Some managers looked intrigued, others uneasy. A few, Rosa noticed, looked downright uncomfortable. Jack raised a hand, silencing the noise. "This isn't punishment. It's a reset. We're rebuilding the kind of company we all wanted to work for when we started here. The kind where people actually want to come to work." Jack stepped back toward the podium, letting the weight of his words settle over the room like a slow-building storm. "And to make one thing absolutely clear," he continued, "these culture scores won't just sit in some HR file gathering dust. They'll directly impact promotions, bonuses, even eligibility to manage more stores. If you want to grow with this company, you need to grow your people first." A ripple of tension spread across the room. Managers shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances. For some, this was a wake-up call. For others, it was a warning shot. "But this isn't just about accountability," Jack said, softening his tone slightly. "It's about giving you the tools to succeed. Starting next month, we're launching the Leadership Reset Program. Mandatory retraining for every store manager, assistant manager, and shift lead. Real training, not just paperwork. Workshops on conflict resolution, team building, even emotional intelligence." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Rosa, who was still seated near the side of the stage. "And guess who's helping us build that program?" Rosa's eyes widened in surprise. Jack hadn't told her this part. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Jack said. "It's about learning from the people who are getting it right. People like Rosa, who lead with empathy and grit and heart. That's the future of leadership at Lone Star." For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then, slowly, managers began to nod. Some reluctantly, others thoughtfully. A few even with a sense of relief, like they'd been waiting for permission to lead differently. "We're not perfect," Jack finished, "but we're not afraid to admit when we've gone off track. And we're sure as hell not afraid to change." As the meeting ended, Rosa felt the shift in the air. Not a sudden, dramatic transformation, but the first crack of light after a long, dark storm. Rosa stood at the back door of the Westheimer Lone Star, clipboard in hand, scanning the checklist she'd built from scratch after returning from the leadership conference. It wasn't just a corporate checklist. This one had her personal touch, filled with reminders like check in with Hattie and ask Cody how school's going. Little things Felix never would have bothered with. It was a normal Tuesday, or at least it should have been, until the corporate sedan pulled into the parking lot. Rosa's stomach flipped the moment she saw it. The glossy Lone Star logo stamped on the door. The kind of car that only showed up when someone important was about to poke around. The back door opened, and out stepped Brian Lambert, one of the most feared internal auditors in the company. Rosa had only seen his name in emails before, attached to phrases like corrective action and final warning. He wasn't just here to observe, he was here to test her. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, forcing a smile as Brian approached the counter. "Welcome to Westheimer," she said, voice bright but heart-pounding. "Manager on duty?" Brian asked, already scribbling something on his tablet. "That's me," Rosa said. Brian glanced up, surprised. "Oh, right. You're the one from the conference." Rosa couldn't tell if that was good or bad. "We'll start with a full walkthrough," Brian said. "Back of house, front of house, customer experience, everything." Rosa swallowed hard, then nodded. "Let's do it." The walkthrough started in the kitchen, where every surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Hattie had gone above and beyond, scrubbing every inch after closing the night before, and it showed. Brian ran a finger along the fryer handles, checking for grease buildup, then jotted something down on his tablet. He didn't smile, didn't frown, completely unreadable. Cody stood at the grill, flipping patties with the confidence that came from knowing Rosa had his back. Brian asked a few quick questions, food safety temps, cross-contamination protocols, and Cody answered without hesitation. "So far, so good," Brian said flatly, before moving toward the storage area. That's where Rosa braced herself. Inventory had been a mess under Felix, and while she'd worked hard to fix it, some of the old bad habits still lingered in the system. To her relief, the shelves were organized and labeled, thanks to a full team reset they'd done last week. Hattie's meticulous touch was everywhere. Brian scanned the labels, checked the dates, and made another note. Finally, they moved to the front counter. This was the moment Rosa knew would matter most, not just for the inspection, but for her crew's confidence in her leadership. Brian ordered a burger, fries, and a drink, timing the entire process. Rosa stepped back, letting her team handle it. No interference, no coaching, just trusting them to do what they'd practiced. The order came out fast, accurate and with a smile. Rosa felt her chest swell with quiet pride. Brian took one bite of the burger, set it down, and looked directly at Rosa. "You've done good work here," he said, voice low but sincere. Jack wasn't exaggerating. Relief flooded her veins, but Rosa kept her face steady. "Thank you," she said. Brian closed his tablet. "Keep it up. We'll be back in 3 months." As he walked out, Cody fist-pumped behind the counter, and Hattie gave Rosa a wink. The storm had passed, for now. But Rosa knew the biggest test was still ahead, proving that this wasn't a fluke, that the culture she was building could survive the long haul. The ballroom at the Lone Star annual gala shimmered under soft, golden lights, the kind of glow that made everything, even paper tablecloths and plastic centerpieces, look a little more elegant than they really were. Rosa sat at a table near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the new Manager of the Year badge pinned proudly to her dress. Cody sat beside her, awkward in a tie that was clearly borrowed, and Hattie was on her other side, wearing a bright turquoise blouse that caught the light every time she moved. It still didn't feel real. When Jack called her 2 weeks ago to say she was receiving the award, Rosa thought he was joking. She wasn't a corporate success story. No fancy degrees, no long resume of promotions. Just a cashier who refused to quit. But tonight, as she watched managers from across Texas take their seats, she realized something had changed. They didn't just see her as the girl from the viral video anymore. They saw her as a leader. As the dinner plates were cleared, Jack stepped onto the stage. The room quieted immediately. He didn't need a microphone to command attention. His presence was enough. "Tonight," Jack began, "we're celebrating more than sales numbers or new store openings. We're celebrating who we are and who we're becoming." He paused, scanning the room. "A year ago, I stood on this stage and realized I didn't recognize the company I built. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that Lone Star was never meant to be about spreadsheets and quotas. It was supposed to be about people, about building a place where hard work was valued, kindness mattered, and every employee knew they belonged." Jack smiled toward Rosa's table. "And no one reminded me of that better than Rosa Martinez." Rosa felt her cheeks flush, but she forced herself to lift her head. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever stood behind that counter, too scared to speak up, too exhausted to believe things could ever change. Jack continued. "Rosa didn't just step up when her store fell apart. She rebuilt it, not with policies and threats, but with respect, empathy, and grit. She proved that leadership isn't about power. It's about trust." The room erupted into applause, but Jack wasn't finished. "Rosa taught us that leadership starts at eye level. When you look your team in the eye, roll up your sleeves, and work right alongside them. That's the culture we're building at Lone Star. And tonight, I'm proud to name Rosa as our first ever Culture Champion of the Year." The applause grew louder, and Rosa stood, unsure whether to smile or cry. She made her way to the stage, her heels clicking too loudly in the quiet between claps, and Jack handed her the plaque. His grip was firm, but his smile was soft. "Thank you," Rosa said, voice trembling slightly as she faced the room. "I'm standing here because I didn't stand alone. My crew, my customers, even my mistakes, they all shaped me. And I promise you, if a cashier like me can lead, so can any of you. All it takes is remembering why we started this work in the first place." The applause swelled again, but this time Rosa didn't feel out of place. She belonged here, and so did her story. As she stepped down from the stage, Hattie hugged her, Cody whistled, and Jack leaned in quietly. "This is just the beginning," he said. Rosa smiled. "I know.